One of my favorite Old Testament stories is in 1 Samuel chapters 13 and 14. Saul has just come to the kingship, and his first act as king is to muster an army. So he gets this army with 3,000 soldiers. He takes 2,000, gives 1,000 to his son Jonathan, and they're all set. Now I use the term soldier very loosely because really these guys, they're not trained and they're not equipped. In the whole Israelite army, only Saul and Jonathan had weapons and armor. This is because the Philistines controlled the land at that time, and they controlled the metallurgy. So the Israelite soldiers were armed with farm tools, and they even had to take their tools to the Philistines to get them sharpened. So, I use the term soldiers loosely there. Now, Jonathan took his 1,000 and immediately went out and attacked the Philistines. Now, the Philistines got upset and they mustered their army. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and soldiers like the sand on the seashore. Now, the Israelites were nobody's fool, at least most of them weren't. So most of them either hid themselves in caves and pits and holes in the ground, or crossed the Jordan to run, or they went as traders to be with the Philistines, leaving 600 men with Saul and Jonathan, and pitifully they gathered under the pomegranate tree near Migron, and they waited. Now I believe these 600 men were men of faith, somehow believing that God could deliver them, or at least that it was a cause worth dying for. But one man distinguished himself. Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Let's show ourselves to the Philistine outpost, and if they call us up, it will be a sign for us that God has delivered them into our hands. For God is not limited to save, whether by many or by few." His armor-bearer said, "I'm with you heart and soul. Do everything that you've said." So they show themselves to the outpost, and they say, "Look, the Hebrews are coming out from the holes where they've hidden themselves." They said, "Come up here, we'll teach you a lesson." That was what Jonathan was waiting for. So he and his armor-bearer scaled the cliff there, and the two of them killed 20 men within half an acre of ground. A mighty act of valor, to be sure, but in the larger scheme of things, pointless. But when God saw the faith of Jonathan, God intervened. God stepped in. He sent a trembling in the camp, an earthquake, and the Philistine army panicked and began to melt away. So about this time, Saul is there with the other soldiers and sees this great force, that's surrounding them, just melting away. So he realizes something's up, numbers the people, finds out, those two are gone, eventually gets around to calling them to join in the pursuit. So the faith of Jonathan, that expectant faith, that risk-taking faith, that sacrificial faith, that was contagious to those men who had some faith. And then that was contagious to those who had fled or hidden themselves or gone as traders, as they all returned and joined in the pursuit. And then the Philistine soldiers began striking down one another in their great panic, so that a great battle was won that day, as the battle spread beyond Bethaven, and the Israelites regained a huge amount of territory. That faith of Jonathan was different than the faith of those who had the courage to stand under the pomegranate tree with Saul. It was an expectant faith. not based on the physical situation that he saw, but based on the spiritual reality, the promises of the Lord, his character, his power. It reminds me of, you remember when Elisha was telling the king of Israel about the plans of the king of Aram, and the king of Aram began getting frustrated because this happened over and over. So he sent his army after Elisha, and Elisha's in Dothan, and his servant goes out and he sees this whole army surrounding their home, and he's worried, he's frightened. And Elisha prays to the Lord, Lord, open his eyes. And he saw these chariots of fire of the army of God surrounding their house. And he said, there are more with us than are with them. He had the spiritual eyes to see the spiritual realities, the spiritual situation. And Jonathan had that same vision. It's like the Apostle Peter. You remember when he was walking on the water, he was doing fine as long as he had his eyes on Jesus. But when he looked at the wind and the waves, he was sunk, literally. Focusing on the spiritual realities, on the eternal power of God and his character. Or like the spies who were sent in to spy out the promised land. You had the 10 who saw the giants and the great walled cities, and so their decision was that they should go back to Egypt. But Joshua and Caleb, yes, they saw the walled cities, the giants, but they focused on the promise of God and his power, and they said, we can do this. With God, we can do this. So this Jonathan's expectant faith was based on his focus on God's character and his power. Again, I'm not saying that God can't use us if we don't have that level of faith. But I am saying that we should not be satisfied with anything less. We need to continually aspire to that kind of faith, and that is the kind of disciple God delights to multiply.